June 15, 1939, 10:18 a.m. The offices of Harlem Property Trust on 125th Street, a newly formed real estate company occupying the second floor of a building that had previously housed a dress shop before closing. During the Great Depression that had devastated Harlem's economy more severely than most other neighborhoods in Manhattan because black residents lacked access to federal relief programs and banking credit that helped white communities survive the economic collapse that followed the 1929 stock market crash. The office was furnished with expensive desks and leather chairs that communicated wealth and professional legitimacy, decorated with maps showing property parcels throughout Harlem marked with different colored pins, indicating various stages of acquisition or negotiation, creating visual representation of systematic campaign to purchase buildings and land that would fundamentally change who controlled real estate in neighborhood where black residents lived, but white landlords owned most buildings and collected rents that enriched them while maintaining deteriorating properties that violated basic standards of safety and sanitation. Harold Westfield sat behind the largest desk, reviewing documents. A 49-year-old white real estate developer from Connecticut who had recognized opportunity in Harlem's economic distress. Understanding that depression had created circumstances where property values had collapsed to fractions of what they had been worth in the prosperous 1920s, when Harlem Renaissance brought cultural vitality and economic growth that attracted investment and migration from black Americans seeking better opportunities than Southern segregation offered. Westfield had spent the past 18 months quietly purchasing properties throughout Harlem, using various shell companies and intermediaries to obscure the fact that single buyer was systematically acquiring buildings that could be consolidated into portfolio, generating substantial rental income once depression ended and economic recovery restored property values to pre-1929 levels. His strategy was predatory but perfectly legal, buying distressed properties from desperate owners at prices far below actual value, then raising rents on tenants who had nowhere else to go because racism prevented black residents from moving to white neighborhoods where better housing might be available at comparable prices. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stood near the window overlooking 125th Street, watching traffic and pedestrians moving through Harlem's main commercial corridor. His presence in Westfield's office, the result of meeting requested by the developer who wanted to discuss business opportunities with someone whose influence in Harlem's community made him valuable potential partner or dangerous potential obstacle, depending on whether cooperation could be negotiated on terms acceptable to both parties. Bumpy was 33 years old in June 1939, already established as significant figure in Harlem's criminal underworld through his work with Stephanie St. Clair's numbers operation. Someone whose intelligence and strategic thinking had earned respect from both black community members who benefited from his protection and white criminals who recognized that underestimating him would be a costly mistake. Bumpy's expression revealed nothing about his assessment of Westfield's operation or his intentions regarding the proposal that was about to be presented. Westfield began speaking in tone that combined businesslike professionalism with subtle condescension that characterized how many white men addressed black men, regardless of the latter's actual intelligence or accomplishments. Mr. Johnson, thank you for coming today. I wanted to discuss my real estate activities in Harlem and explore whether we might find mutually beneficial arrangement that would serve both our interests. As you've probably noticed, I've been purchasing properties throughout this neighborhood over the past year and a half. I now own or control approximately 170 buildings containing nearly 3,000 residential units, which makes me one of the largest landlords in Harlem. My plan is to modernize these properties, improve living conditions for tenants, and create profitable real estate portfolio that will generate substantial returns once economic recovery begins. However, I recognize that operating successfully in Harlem requires understanding community dynamics and maintaining good relationships with local leaders who influence how residents respond to changes in property ownership and management practices. That's where you come in. If you've ever watched someone present an offer that sounds reasonable until you realize they re-asking you to help them exploit your own community to profit from enabling someone else's predatory scheme. Leave a comment about the moment you understood that cooperation would make you complicit in harm being done to people you're supposed to protect. And subscribe to this channel because what you're about to witness is how. Bumpy Johnson recognized immediately that Harold Westfield's proposal was unbusiness opportunity, but rather invitation to betray Harlem's residents, and how Bumpy responded by declaring war against racist real estate system without firing single shot or breaking single law, proving that smartest victories come from understanding systems better than the people who created them. Westfield continued explaining his proposal. What I need from you, Mr. Johnson, is help maintaining order in my properties and ensuring that rent collection proceeds smoothly without tenant resistance or organizing activities that could create problems for efficient management. In exchange, I am prepared to pay you $10,000 annually, plus 2% of gross rental income from all properties I control, which would currently amount to approximately $8,000 yearly based on current rental rates. That's $8,000 and $1,000 per year for relatively minimal works, simply using your influence to prevent tenant complaints from escalating into rent strikes or other disruptions that would reduce profitability. It is generous compensation for what amounts to community relations work that benefits everyone by maintaining stable housing situation rather than creating conflicts that would be bad for tenants and landlords alike. Bumpy turned from the window to face Westfield directly, his expression still neutral but his eyes revealing assessment of character and intentions that went beyond surface presentation of business proposal. Mr. Westfield, let me make sure I understand your offer correctly. You want me to help you exploit Harlem's residents by preventing them from organizing against rent increases or demanding repairs for deteriorating properties that you're going to continue neglecting despite your claims about modernization and improved living conditions. You want me to use my influence in this community to suppress resistance to predatory landlord practices that will extract maximum profit while providing minimum services or property maintenance. And you think $18,000 annually is appropriate compensation for me betraying people who trust me to protect their interests rather than facilitating their exploitation by outside developers who see Harlem as opportunity to get rich from other people. As poverty and desperation. Is that an accurate summary of what you're proposing? The directness of Bumpy's response clearly surprised Westfield, who had apparently expected either immediate acceptance or at least negotiation about compensation, rather than frontal challenge to fundamental ethics of his entire operation. Westfield's face flushed slightly as he struggled to reformulate his pitch in ways that would address objections without admitting that his characterization of the offer had been accurate. Mr. Johnson, I think you're misunderstanding my intentions. I'm not trying to exploit anyone. I'm providing housing to people who need places to live, and I'm offering fair market rents that are competitive with other landlords in this neighborhood. The improvements I'm planning will benefit tenants by creating better living conditions than they currently have. What I am asking from you is simply help maintaining good relationships with residents so that necessary rent adjustments and property management decisions do create unnecessary conflicts that would harm everyone involved. This is legitimate business, not exploitation. Bumpy's response was quiet, but carried edge that communicated he was unfooled by sanitized description of what Westfield was actually doing. Mr. Westfield, I'm going to decline your offer. I'm not interested in helping you or any other outside developer extract wealth from Harlem's residents while contributing nothing to this community's well-being or economic development. And I'm going to suggest that you reconsider your entire strategy here, because what you're describing is exactly the kind of predatory behavior that creates the problems you supposedly want to avoid. If you proceed with your plans, you're going to discover that Harlem's residents are more organized and more capable of resistance than you apparently realize, and that people who try to exploit this community tend to regret their decisions, eventually. The warning was delivered matter-of-fact, without threats or bluster, simply stating consequences that would follow from choices Westfield was making. Westfield's expression transformed from surprise to anger, the kind of anger that white men often displayed when black men refused to accept subordinate roles or declined to cooperate with arrangements that serve white interests at black people's expense. Mr. Johnson, I don't think you understand your position here. I have 170 buildings in Harlem. I control housing for 3,000 families. I have banking relationships that give me access to capital You couldn't imagine. I have political connections that protect my business interests from interference by local activists or community organizers who might try to create problems. And I have legal resources that allow me to evict tenants who do UNT pay rent or who violate lease terms in ways that justify termination of their housing. You can either work with me and benefit financially from cooperation, or you can oppose me and watch while I do exactly what I plan to do anyway, but without sharing profits with you. Those are your only two options. There's no third possibility where you somehow prevent me from operating my legitimate business in ways that maximized returns on my investments. At precisely this moment, anyone who understood power dynamics in Harlem and in New York's broader real estate and political systems would have recognized that Harold Westfield had made catastrophic miscalculation about who Bumpy Johnson was and what resources he could mobilize against predatory developers who threatened communities, economic stability, and residents' ability to maintain affordable housing in a neighborhood that had become their home and their cultural center during 2 decades of growth and development that white society had largely ignored until depression made Harlem's distressed properties attractive targets for opportunistic investors. Have you ever seen someone confidently enumerate all their advantages without realizing that the person they re-threatening controls the ground they re-standing on? That their supposed power depends on systems they don't actually understand? Leave a comment about the most spectacular case of overconfidence you've witnessed and subscribe now, because Harold Westfield is about to learn that controlling buildings means nothing if you coup and collect rent, maintain services, or protect your investment from coordinated resistance that he never imagined was possible. June 29th, 1939, 3:47 p.m. Harold Westfield sat in his office reviewing financial reports that showed catastrophic 2-week decline in his Harlem real estate operation. 14 days had elapsed since his meeting with Bumpy Johnson, 14 days during which everything that could go wrong with property management business had gone wrong simultaneously, in ways that seemed coordinated but that could not be directly attributed to any single person or organization's actions. Westfield's hands trembled slightly as he reviewed the numbers. Understanding finally that he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of power in Harlem and the capabilities of man he had dismissed as merely local criminal whose influence he could overcome through superior financial resources and political connections. The problems had begun on June 16th, less than 24 hours after Westfield's meeting with Bumpy, when approximately 1,500 tenants across 87 of his buildings simultaneously stopped paying rent. Not formally organized rent strike with demands and negotiations, but rather silent collective action where people simply didn't deliver payment on dates when rent was due, didn't respond to notices demanding payment, didn't engage with property managers or collection agents who visited apartments seeking explanations or arrangements. The coordinated non-payment created immediate cash flow crisis because Westfield's operation depended on rental income to cover mortgage payments and operating expenses for the 170 buildings he controlled through various shell companies and leveraged acquisitions that required substantial monthly debt service to maintain. Within 1 week, Westfield was facing approximately $200,000 in uncollected rent that should have been received to meet his financial obligations. But the rent strike was only first wave of problems that cascaded through Westfield's operation with devastating speed. On June 18th, the building maintenance workers who cleaned common areas, collected trash, and performed minor repairs across Westfield's properties began calling in sick en masse, creating situation where garbage accumulated in hallways and basements, where broken fixtures and minor plumbing problems went unaddressed, where basic services that landlords were legally required to provide simply stopped happening because the workers who normally performed those services were suddenly unavailable. When Westfield attempted to hire replacement workers, he discovered that every maintenance company and cleaning service in Harlem that he contacted declined his business, explaining that they were too busy with existing contracts to take on new clients, despite the fact that depression had created chronic unemployment that should have made finding workers relatively easy. On June 20th, Westfield received simultaneous visits from building inspectors representing the New York City Department of Housing and Buildings at 43 of his properties. where inspectors conducted thorough examinations that identified hundreds of code violations ranging from inadequate heat and hot water to structural deficiencies to pest infestations to fire safety problems that required immediate remediation under threat of substantial fines or potential criminal charges for maintaining buildings in condition dangerous to occupants. The inspections appear to have been triggered by anonymous complaints filed systematically about every building. Westfield owned complaints that were technically accurate, even though many violations had existed for years. Without attracting official attention before outside, developer took ownership and suddenly became target of enforcement action that previous landlords had avoided, through political connections or simple neglect by overwhelmed city agencies. On June 23rd, the banks that had provided financing for Westfield's acquisitions began calling loans and demanding immediate repayment based on provisions in loan agreements, allowing lenders to accelerate repayment schedules. If borrowers experienced significant changes in financial condition, or if properties securing loans were found to be in violation of city codes, the simultaneous loan calls from 3 different banks created liquidity crises that Westfield could unresolve because his assets were entirely tied up in buildings that were suddenly generating no income while requiring substantial expenditures for repairs and code compliance that he could unafford without rental revenue or access to credit that banks were now refusing to extend. If you feeling what Harold Westfield felt in this moment, the absolute panic of watching carefully constructed business empire collapse in 14 days through coordinated actions that left no fingerprints and violated no laws but that nonetheless destroyed everything he had built. You need to hit that like button and subscribe right now, because what Harold Westfield is about to discover is that Bumpy Johnson didn't need to fire single shot to win this war. That real power in Harlem came from understanding community organizing and institutional systems better than any outside developer could match. And that, underestimating Black intelligence and organizational capacity, was the most expensive mistake white businessmen could make when they tried to exploit neighborhoods where residents had learned through generations of oppression how to resist predatory behavior without breaking rules that would justify violent retaliation. On June 29th, Westfield received visit from intermediaries sent by Bumpy Johnson to discuss potential resolution of situation that had destroyed Westfield's Harlem operations in 2 weeks. The intermediary was quiet, professional man who explained matter-of-factly what had happened and what options existed for Westfield going forward. Mr. Johnson wanted me to explain how your problems developed and what he's prepared to offer as solution. The rent strike began because community organizations explained to tenants that they had legal right to withhold rent when landlords failed to provide adequate services or maintain properties in habitable condition as required by New York housing laws. The maintenance worker shortage developed because union representatives advised workers that employment with landlords who systematically violated housing codes could expose them to legal liability for participating in illegal rental operations. The building inspections happened because concerned citizens filed complaints about dangerous conditions they had observed in buildings throughout neighborhood. And the bank loan calls happened because financial institutions received information indicating that properties securing their loans were subject to code enforcement actions that could reduce property values below amounts necessary to protect lenders' interests. The explanation made clear that every action taken against Westfield had been technically legal and procedurally proper, that nothing Bumpy Johnson had done constituted criminal conspiracy or interference with legitimate business operations, that Westfield's problems resulted entirely from consequences of his own choices about how to operate rental properties and from natural responses by tenants and workers and regulators who were simply exercising their legal rights and fulfilling their official responsibilities. The intermediary continued, Mr. Johnson is prepared to resolve your situation through purchase of your Harlem properties at fair market value, reflecting their current condition and income-generating potential. Given the rent strike code violations and debt service obligations, you're facing. Mr. Johnson estimates fair market value of your entire portfolio at approximately $2,800,000, which would be sufficient to pay off your bank loans and leave you with small profit on your original investments. Alternatively, you can attempt to resolve these problems independently, which will require approximately 6 months and $2 million in repairs and legal fees and lost rental income, during which time your banks will likely foreclose on properties and you'll lose everything you've invested over the past 18 months. Mr. Johnson recommends accepting his purchase offer, which will allow you to exit Harlem with your financial survival intact rather than continuing to fight battle you've already lost. Westfield understood immediately that he had no realistic alternative to accepting Bumpy's offer. Continuing to operate his Harlem properties under current circumstances would bankrupt him within 3 months, and attempting to fight coordinated resistance from entire community was an impossible task that would require resources and time he did unpossess. What happens to the tenants if I sell to Mr. Johnson? How do I know he will? Unexploit them the same way I was accused of planning to exploit them. The question revealed that Westfield still didn't fully understand what had happened or why community had mobilized against him so effectively. The intermediary responded patiently. Mr. Johnson has no intention of exploiting Harlem's residents. He plans to transfer ownership of the buildings to community housing cooperative that will be managed by residents themselves, with rents set at affordable levels that cover maintenance and operating costs without generating profits for outside investors. The properties will belong to people who live in them, which is exactly opposite of your strategy of extracting maximum wealth from community without contributing anything to its development or stability. That SY resistance to your operation was so effective, people were fighting to protect their homes and their neighborhood from predatory outsider, not just complaining about one landlord's business practices. Harold Westfield signed papers transferring ownership of 100 Harlem buildings to Bumpy Johnson on July 7, 1939, exactly 3 weeks after their initial meeting where Westfield had explained that he controlled housing for 3,000 families and had banking, relationships, and political connections that made him invincible to local resistance. The transfer price was $2,750,000, which allowed Westfield to pay off his bank loans and recover approximately 8% profit on his original investment after accounting for acquisition costs and operating losses during 2 weeks when rent collection ceased completely. By July 5-10, Bumpy had organized community housing cooperative that would manage the properties going forward with elected boards of residents, making decisions about maintenance priorities, rent levels, and building improvements that would serve community's interests rather than maximizing returns for outside investors who saw Harlem primarily as opportunity to profit from other people as poverty. The story of how Bumpy Johnson defeated Harold Westfield's attempt to consolidate control over Harlem real estate became legendary in neighborhood and beyond. Told as example of how community organizing and strategic use of legal systems could overcome opponents who possessed superior financial resources and political connections, but who lacked understanding of power dynamics in communities where residents had learned through generations of oppression how to resist exploitation without resorting to violence that would justify retaliation from authorities who typically supported white business interests over black community welfare. If you want to discover more stories about how Bumpy Johnson protected Harlem from predatory outsiders without firing single shot, subscribe to this channel and leave your like so more people learn that. In 1939, racist real estate system met its match when criminal boss proved to be smarter community organizer than wealthy developer who thought money and connections guaranteed victory. What made Bumpy's victory particularly significant was that it established template for resistance that communities throughout United States would adopt during following decades when urban renewal and gentrification threatened to displace black residents from neighborhoods they had built and maintained during periods when white society ignored their existence, until real estate values made those neighborhoods attractive targets for redevelopment and displacement. The legal tactics Bumpy employed coordinated rent withholding based on legitimate housing code violations, strategic filing of complaints that triggered official inspections, pressure on banks through revelation of risks associated with properties securing loans all became standard tools for tenant organizing and community resistance that civil rights movement would formalize and expand during 1960s and 1970. South, when housing, discrimination, and urban displacement became central issues in struggles for racial and economic justice, Harold Westfield never attempted another real estate investment in Harlem or in any other predominantly black neighborhood, having learned through expensive experience that communities possessed defensive capabilities that far exceeded what racist assumptions had led him to expect. He returned to Connecticut, where he focused on suburban development projects, serving white middle-class families who represented more predictable and less organized tenant populations than Harlem's residents had proven to be. He died in 1961. Never understanding that his failure in Harlem resulted not from bad luck or temporary market conditions, but rather from fundamental miscalculation about intelligence and organizational capacity of people he had dismissed as vulnerable targets, incapable of effective resistance to predatory business practices backed by racist systems that supposedly protected white investors' interests, regardless of harm caused to black communities. Bumpy Johnson's victory, without firing single shot, demonstrated that smartest form of power often operates through systems rather than against them, that understanding legal frameworks and institutional processes better than your opponents allows you to turn their supposed advantages into vulnerabilities they never imagined existed. The community housing cooperative that Bumpy established continued operating successfully for more than 30 years, providing affordable housing to thousands of Harlem families during a period when urban renewal and displacement destroyed similar communities throughout New York City and other major metropolitan areas. When Bumpy died in 1968, memorial services in Harlem included speeches from tenant organizers and community activists who credited him with saving neighborhood from predatory development that would have displaced residents and destroyed cultural institutions that made Harlem a vitally important center of black American life and culture during 20th century's most turbulent decades of social change and civil rights struggle that transformed America's understanding of racial justice and equal opportunity.